It's been really terrific to be here in Atlanta, in Georgia, and to sort of be thinking about those connections about Black women, about slavery, about the Old South, as I write and as I think. I'm about halfway through the new book. I've finished 4 chapters out of 8. You know, draft chapters, certainly, so not terribly polished. But what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a little bit of an understanding of where this talk today falls in the overall project. So it's going to be an 8-chapter book, as I mentioned, and the talk that I'm giving today will essentially come out of chapter 3, because I realized that it would be really difficult for me to give you a talk on a chapter that comes further down in the book, because even though it has some really juicy material later on in the book, it just wouldn't make sense unless you understand some of the things that come earlier. So the introduction is going to actually have material from some of the descendants that I've met of the family. They're going to start the project out. I was lucky enough to meet some of them and interview them a couple of years ago. Chapter 1 will actually have introductory material on Kentucky, because if you're like me, I knew nothing about the settling of Kentucky until I started working on this project. Because my first book was on South Carolina, and so I really had to learn about, about Kentucky. Chapter 2 is really just very basic information on Richard Johnson, Julia's partner, and about his life before he met her. So really, really basic political biography stuff. Because I want the book to be about Julia and her daughters. I don't want him dominating and taking over the story. And so we want to get his stuff over with. And this way the rest of the book can really be about her and her daughters. And so chapter 3 is really when she and her daughters really come to the forefront. And that's the part that I'll be speaking from today. And then the rest of the book, we talk about obviously more of her life, but we talk about, the book is kind of done not necessarily chronologically, but more geographically. So we talk about her life on the farm, her and her daughter's life around school, Choctaw Academy, life at church, the Baptist church at Great Crossing, their life sort of around town, and particularly places like Frankfort, Kentucky, the state capital, Georgetown, which is the town closest to them, as well as Lexington. Don't know what happened. I must have hit something. Don't know what I did. Just. Go back the other way. Yep. One more. Over. Right. Right there. Thanks. If it's not my own computer, I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah. And then we go, the chapter I just finished writing last week, I'm writing out of order, is when we go to the nation state. So we move from smallest, right? Home, school, church, town, and then we go to nation. That's the chapter I just finished writing. We sort of go literally to the country at large. And then we end with, we do sort of eventually end up chronological in a way. We end up, at the end of days when people are dying, essentially. And we talk about sort of the children and grandchildren and how things change with Jim Crow and segregation after slavery. And then we come back to the descendants and we let them have the last word. So with that, without further ado, let me get into the formal part of the paper. And I really look forward to the end. That's my favorite part, when you get to ask me all kinds of questions. So yeah, I hopefully won't go too fast. I've been told that sometimes I can get excited and start going a little bit too fast. If so, just kind of say, hey, raise your hands, kind of go, slow down, Dr. Myers, and I will do my best to do so. Alrighty. The subject of interracial sex between slaveholders and the enslaved, from violent assaults to decades-long partnerships, occupies significant space in the American memory. The most obvious example is the public's long interest in Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. This relationship was not unique, however. My current book project on Julia Chinn, a Black woman, and Richard M. Johnson, a career politician from Kentucky, highlights the deep and lengthy connections between race, slavery, sex, and politics in U.S. history. What did it mean to be the Black wife of a white man in the slave South? How much privilege did that association bring a woman of color, and where were the limits of that power? What did life look like for the children of such couples? How did a man attain political office in such a society while acknowledging his ties to his black family? How does this story remain in the shadows for almost 2 centuries to the point where it was lost even to many of the couple's own descendants? These are just some of the questions that my work attempts to answer. Set in rural Kentucky in the 1800s, Julia and Richard's story seems typical at first glance. A black woman was domestically connected to a white man. The Union, however, has much to teach us about the impact of race, slavery, and sex on the American political landscape. At its core, Remembering Julia reveals how black women used intimate relationships to acquire power in the Old South. It highlights where the lines of acceptance were drawn for all members of mixed-race families. And it illuminates how locale and place shaped the limits of that power for black women. As they moved away from their homes, where their ties to local whites opened certain doors for them, black women's ability to behave as free persons declined. Using the construct of circles of power, the book thus begins with the smallest circle, the home. It then begins to move out in larger circles, to school, to church, and then town, always further from home, and with a steady loss of power to black women, until it reaches the largest circle where black women have the least power of all, that of the nation state. In my first book, Forging Freedom, I analyzed the stories of several black women who were involved in long-term relationships with white women in Antebellum, Charleston, South Carolina. And I highlight how black women's access to numerous privileges was often the result of their connections to financially stable men, whether black, white, or native. Interrogating how women of color utilized these unions to negotiate more rights than the law gave to them, I illuminate the reactions of white Charlestonians to such partnerships. While they were not warmly embraced, the couples were also not the targets of overt hostility, unless they openly divide certain societal rules, such as attending church together. The lack of violence differed significantly from how interracial couples would be treated after the Civil War. As I finished Forging Freedom, I became increasingly interested in the possibilities that interracial sex opened up for antebellum black women, the responses of whites towards such behaviors, and the differences in those responses locally versus nationally. I knew those questions were best answered by analyzing one partnership, which would bring one family into focus and, when placed alongside the growing literature on interracial sex, would allow for broader conclusions to be drawn about gender, race, and power across the South. It could also illuminate the attitudes of local communities towards interracial families versus national debates over interracial sex. That's what led me to the story of Julia and Richard, a Kentuckian who spent nearly 4 decades of his life as an elected official in Washington, D.C. While Julia Chinn is hardly a household name, most Americans do not recognize the name of Richard Mentor Johnson either. How many of you have heard of Richard Johnson before today? Oh, look, not one hand. Okay, proves my point. Great. Born in what is now Louisville, Kentucky in 1780, Richard belonged to a planter family with Virginia roots, his parents having migrated to Kentucky from Virginia in 1779. A plantation owner, lawyer, and slaveholder, Richard was also a war hero who captured the national spotlight in 1813 after supposedly killing the Shawnee chief Tecumseh during the War of 1812. Additionally, he spent over 40 years of his life in public service, including one term as Vice President of the United States. And yet none of you, or me, had ever heard of him. I had never heard of him, and I'm a 19th century US historian. Okay, that's embarrassing. Elected to office for the first time in 1806, Richard appears to have been well regarded in his home district of Scott County, Kentucky. In 1829, however, Richard, whose fame had grown during the 1820s, lost his US Senate seat. Although his home district returned him to the House of Representatives the next year, and he remained in politics in various capacities until his death in 1850, there was a problem in 1829. And I'm positive, now that I've done 7 years of research, that his loss that year stemmed from his ties to Julia Chinn. So now we turn to Julia. Even those who have heard about her may know less than they think, since so much of the information about her is based on local legends, speculation, or rumor, and hasn't always been verified. For instance, some writers have claimed that the Johnson women lived in D.C. with Richard when Congress was in session, One essay concludes that while Richard never married, he, quote, installed one Julia Chinn in his magnificent house on East Street, along with their 2 children, Imogene and Adeline. Another account also places Julia in D.C., claiming that she was, quote, a prominent figure of Kentucky and Washington life, and that when Richard wasn't, quote, delightedly breaking ties in Senate votes as vice president, he and Julia ran off to Kentucky to manage the hotel he built on his property at White Sulphur Springs. Indeed, Julia is said to have served as the vice president's official hostess in Washington and at White Sulphur Springs, while the couple's daughters were educated in the, quote, magnificent house on East Street, given the Johnson name, and were welcomed at Ward Hall, which was a family property in Kentucky. Still others claim that when DC socialites refused to accept Julia at their parties, Richard virtually stopped going out. Now, while this all makes for exciting and one might even say sexy reading, there is no documentation that places Julia or their daughters anywhere near Washington, D.C. No newspapers refer to their presence in the nation's capital, and family letters place Richard in D.C. and the Johnson women in Kentucky, where they took care of the plantation and his business interests while he was away. Richard himself lived in a boarding house in D.C. and was publicly referred to in that city as a bachelor. Additionally, records indicate that the daughters, Imogene and Adeline, were educated in Scott County, Kentucky. Not only that, Julia herself had passed away by the time Richard became vice president in 1837. It would have then been impossible for her to have acted as the vice president's official hostess in Washington, or to have run off with him on wild adventures in Kentucky whenever the mood struck. So in the midst of these conflicting reports about her life, we can't even be sure about what Julia looked like, because there are no confirmed portraits of her that are known to exist. Indeed, while everyone agrees that she was a woman of African descent, she has been variously referred to in a multitude of records as a Negro, an African, a mulatto, brown, yellow, freckled, an octoroon, who was fair enough to pass for white. Her legal status is also unclear. She might have been enslaved, or she could have been free. We do not know how she acquired the last name of Chinn, although the fact that she had a last name suggests that she may have been a free person. On the other hand, local legend has it that Julia was originally the property of Richard's father, Robert Johnson. Raised to be a house servant by Richard's mother, Jemima S. Johnson, who was known to be, quote, one of the most exemplary and pious of women, this account states that Julia came to live with Richard because Robert gave her to his son as part of the latter's inheritance. Certain contemporaries state that Richard then took Julia as his mistress, in part to punish his mother, because Jemima objected to her son's engagement to a poor white seamstress. Others say that the woman was a northern school teacher. Nothing worse than your son trying to marry a Yankee, apparently. Now, this happened before the War of 1812. Now, Richard apparently ended the relationship, but supposedly he told his mother that she would come to regret her actions. Now, Julia's marital status is also up for debate. She could have been Richard's legal wife, his willing, I use that word in quotation marks, we'll get back to it, common law partner, or his coerced mistress. Now, historian Roger Kennedy treats the pair as if they were married, concluding that since Richard treated his consort, Julia Chinn, as his wife, that she probably was, although no one had the nerve to ask them to produce a marriage license. Contemporary John Wilson, who knew Richard, claimed that, quote, Colonel Dick, as he called him, had a black wife named Julia Chinn, and that the pair had, quote, been secretly married by Reverend Thomas Henderson. We're going to meet Thomas Henderson in a few minutes. Now, there's nothing in Thomas Henderson's personal papers that proves that he married Julia and Richard, but he may have chosen not to record the marriage in his books, knowing what a scandal that would have caused. Additionally, there are no free papers that have been discovered for Julia or her daughters, nor has a marriage license for Julia and Richard ever turned up, not that I have been able to find. But no freedom papers or manumission papers, as they would have been called, might mean that Julia was never enslaved, therefore she would have never needed them. And the marriage license could have been lost or destroyed. The Scott County Courthouse burned down 3 times in the antebellum period. It was actually really common for that to happen back in the day. Fire was like the big fear and the big destroyer. It was a common occurrence. It made my research also rather difficult. Dang thing kept burning down. So while the documentation is incomplete, certain individuals clearly believe that Julia and Richard were married. Judge James Y. Kelly, who knew Richard when he was a young man, said in 1929 when he was interviewed that, quote, old Colonel Johnson had a mulatto wife. At various times during his own life, Richard himself referred to Julia as his wife. In a private letter that he wrote to a friend, Richard mentioned, quote, his bride. And he supposedly released a statement to the press during the vice presidential election of 1836, which stated that, quote, unlike Jefferson, Clay, and Poindexter and others, I married my wife under the eyes of God, and apparently he has found no objections, quote. Keep in mind, however, that Kentucky law did not recognize marriages between whites and Negroes or mulattoes. That was the wording of the day, right? But state law also defined a mulatto as someone who had, quote, 1/4 or other larger part of Negro blood. If Julia Chinn had less than 25% African ancestry, as some contemporary sources assert, referring to her as an octoroon, then by legal standards of the day, she would actually have been white. It's vital to remember, however, that if she were legally enslaved, that would have made Julia socially and culturally black in the eyes of the larger society in which she lived, regardless of any legal gray areas. So much about Julia remains unknown or unconfirmed, including where and when she was born, who her parents were. So what do we actually know about her? We know that she was a woman of color. We know that she was literate. We know that she and Richard lived together for 22 years at least, and that they had 2 daughters together named Imogene and Adeline. Richard openly acknowledged the girls as his children. He had them educated, and he treated Julia as his wife. And since his career kept him in Washington, D.C. for large parts of the year, it was Julia who handled the daily business of running his plantation, Blue Spring Farm. This included dealing with local businessmen and overseeing the estate's slave labor force. A God-fearing woman, Julia attended Great Crossings Baptist Church. That church, by the way, was founded by Richard's parents. Keep that in mind. It's just a mile down the road from the plantation, and it still exists. Yeah, it still exists. I went there. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey doing this project. So she attended that church. She interacted with members of the institution. She also had regular contact on a daily basis with the headmaster and the students of a federally funded boarding school for Indian boys that was located on Blue Spring property. That was Choctaw Academy, right? That's the school that shows up in chapter 4 of the book. So known as Choctaw Academy, the school opened up in 1825 and remained in operation until the 1840s. A close reading of Richard Johnson's letters to Thomas Henderson, who was headmaster of that school, yields additional nuggets of precious information about Julia and her daughters and their life on Blue Spring Farm. It's Imogene's birth date of February 1812 that suggests that Richard and Julia were together for at least 22 years. It's also clear from those letters that Julia and the girls lived at Blue Spring even while Richard was away for long periods of time. Now, when he came home, it's unclear if the couple actually lived in the same house. There were several buildings on the property, including a brick house that Richard referred to as my great house. Julia, however, had her own residence at Blue Spring that was called the Stone House. Now, it's possible that the couple lived together when Richard was at home, but Julia also had her own space. And this wasn't necessarily an insult. Julia's position in Richard's life could have earned her the privilege of her own home. And we know that it was a structure large enough to accommodate a 3-room library and where she was in charge. Indeed, she may well have requested this home as part of the couple's relational arrangement. Still, the house was never really hers. Blue Spring and everything on it was Richard's property. Consider that in 1825, Richard wrote to Thomas that if more housing was required for the Indian students of Choctaw Academy, he would just take over Julia's home. Quote, "At any time I could appropriate that whole house if necessary." End quote. Just remember, he's a white male plantation owner and a slaveholder, right? This is patriarchy at its best. Privilege then did not mean absolute power. But still, Julia held considerable authority at Blue Spring. That Richard relied on her to make sure things ran smoothly in his absence is evident when he tells Thomas that, quote, "If Julia should remain well enough to attend to my matters, she will make all do their duty as to conduct and industry, and she will only want your assistance to make all act with the same propriety as if I were at home. If she should get unwell, you will have to take a little more trouble upon yourself to see that no disorder takes place with my people." This letter and others reveal that while Julia attended to a variety of matters at Blue Spring, one of the things that she had specific charge over was Blue Spring's slave labor force. It was her job to make all do their duty, to behave themselves, and to be industrious. She was also to report to Thomas as to which of Richard's slaves acts well and who among them acts ill. He, in turn, was to, quote, "support her authority and tell her to make all complaints to you." The reason Julia was to relay her concerns to Henderson is clarified in additional letters which reveal that he was to punish those slaves who were acting ill. Things evidently didn't always run smoothly in Richard's absence. In December of 1825, Richard was uneasy because Julia was having trouble with two slaves named Daniel and Jerry. She couldn't get the men to help take care of a sick Indian student. And in addition to that, all the men had apparently, quote, "gone away," except Sandy and Jacob Chase. Gone away, I'm not quite sure what that means, but apparently they had taken off. Frustrated that these sorts of issues arose every winter, Richard told Thomas that he should, quote, "converse with Julia and ascertain who has dodged and shucked and with whom she has had difficulty, and then chastise them on their naked skin." He went on to state that if Henderson was unwilling to do the whippings himself, he should call for a constable to flog the slave in question, or as a last measure, quote, "sell them to Edward C. Johnson for his cotton farm." Just because Johnson had a relationship with a black woman and had two black daughters doesn't mean that he was still not a slaveholder. Making exceptions for the one didn't mean that he made exceptions for anybody else. Like many Southern plantation mistresses then, Julia was left in charge of the farm's slaves while her husband was away. And like those mistresses, Julia found herself faced with a labor force that did not always respect her leadership, likely due in this case to both her race and her gender. Thus, although Julia was given charge over matters at Blue Spring, she, like many other Southern mistresses, still had to rely upon a male overseer to carry out the disciplinary actions required to enforce her authority. Although Julia needed Henderson's help in certain matters, that didn't mean he was in charge over her. In fact, Julia, who was literate, wrote to Richard herself and kept him informed as to what was happening on the plantation in his absence. This included telling him whether Thomas was performing his duties as a headmaster, disciplining the farm slaves, and tutoring the couple's two daughters. In one letter, Julia apparently complained to Richard about the situation with the aforementioned enslaved laborers, Daniel and Jerry. Additionally, in January of 1826, Richard told Henderson that, quote, "Julia informed me what an impressive lecture you gave Daniel, and that you have been very attentive to my requests as to your visits to my house, to hear lessons, and the great influence it has upon the industry of the girls, for fear of you, and for fear that I might have a bad account of them." A month later, Richard mentioned that, quote, "Julia writes me that you have been of great service in making my out hands," that means the farm hands, as opposed to the house servants, "behave well. Thank you." While he may have been grateful that Henderson was keeping up his end of their bargain by tutoring his daughters and helping Julia to maintain discipline at Blue Spring, it's equally likely that Richard wanted the man to realize that if he shirked his responsibilities, Julia was going to let him know. As if dealing with a rebellious labor force, keeping her husband apprised on a variety of plantation matters, and raising the couple's 2 daughters wasn't enough, Julia also helped Henderson run Choctaw Academy during Richard's absences. And he was gone to DC at least half the year, every year. Right? While Thomas was headmaster of the school, Julia had a hand in the actual practical day-to-day tasks that kept the institution going. Known to be a formidable cook, for example, it appears that Julia oversaw at least some of the food preparation for the school. Like her ability to read and write, it's unclear where she came by her cooking skills. If she was raised by Richard's mother as a privileged house servant, as some locals tell it, it's possible that Jemima Johnson taught Julia how to read and write and to cook, not necessarily directly, but by overseeing her apprenticeship to a skilled slave cook on Robert Johnson's farm, perhaps even Julia's unknown mother. Considering Julia's talents in the kitchen, she must have overseen the culinary and overall domestic arrangements for President James Monroe's visit to Kentucky in 1819, during which he actually spent one night at Blue Spring Farm while on his way from Frankfort, the state capital, to Lexington. While there was a public dinner for Monroe in Frankfort one evening, which Richard and Andrew Jackson both attended, the men all relaxed and dined at Blue Spring on a Thursday afternoon in July and stayed there overnight before journeying to Lexington via Georgetown the next day. Blue Spring Farm is actually sandwiched right in between Frankfort, the state capital, and Lexington, Kentucky. If you were to drive there today, it's basically just off of Interstate 64, which you would drive from Louisville to Lexington. So you just go up and down that corridor, you go from Louisville to Frankfort to Lexington, but if you go just off of 64, between Frankfort and Lexington is Georgetown, Kentucky. And there's a little liberal arts college there called Georgetown College. And Blue Spring Farm is no longer, it's a National Historic Site, but there's really no buildings left there, unfortunately, anymore. It's kind of fallen into ruin, but that's where the farm was located. So, James Monroe wasn't the only visitor to Blue Spring. Richard was known for his hospitality. He loved to entertain, and he entertained quite lavishly. He was known for his wine cellar, his fancy parties. He liked to drink. He liked to drink. Yeah, he did. Judge James Y. Kelly of Scott County recounted that, quote, "I heard men say they were treated so well at Blue Spring when they went out there, they loved to go." Julia was used to planning events then, large and small, and probably wasn't surprised when Richard came home from Congress in 1824, and along with some of his neighbors, invited the entire township to come to Blue Spring on July the 3rd in order to, quote, "celebrate the birth of their liberty." Given the numbers expected, Julia would have been one of many wives in the area cooking and overseeing preparations for the spectacle, although the lion's share of the work would have fallen to the host family. And spectacle it was. A special table, 300 feet in length, was prepared to hold all of the food, and the Georgetown Light Infantry was in attendance. The GLI fired off a special salute on the hillside in honor of the occasion, and they were answered by artillery specially planted at the Blue Spring. There actually is a Blue Spring at Blue Spring Farm, which is how it got its name. The cannon were shot off at 11 a.m. to formally start the festivities, and a large crowd listened to speeches, musical selections such as Yankee Doodle, and a reading of the Declaration of Independence by none other than Richard himself. When the speeches and toasts finished, the guests enjoyed a dinner lasting 2 hours. Julia also would have directed matters when General Lafayette visited Kentucky in May of 1825. It's doubtful that the French hero would have visited tiny Georgetown had it not been for Johnson, then at the, quote, noontide of his prosperity. An account from 1927 suggests that he, Lafayette, went by the way of Richard M. Johnson's tavern and perhaps a barbecue at Blue Lick before arriving at Cincinnati on the morning of the 20th of May. Contemporary sources reveal that Lafayette definitely passed through Lexington on the 18th of May and then made a, quote, short stay at the Blue Spring, where he partook of an elegant dinner prepared for him by Colonel R.M. Johnson, and where assembled a large concourse of people of both sexes to behold the nation's guest. Now, members of the neighborhood had helped with various parts of the feast, as thousands of people were expected. Trenches were dug along the actual branch of the Blue Spring on the farm for cooking the roasts, and all the ladies from the area supposedly helped made a cheese weighing 500 pounds. Other accounts refer to 500 individual cheese balls. Either way, there was a lot of cheese. Yeah, it was a lot of cheese. The entertainment included specific piano performances by certain female guests, as well as exhibitions by students from the Choctaw Academy. When Lafayette left Blue Spring, he, quote, entered his carriage amidst the hearty greetings of a large assemblage of citizens who had assembled to take their last leave of him. Now, there is absolutely no reason to think that Richard actually prepared any part of that elegant dinner. Of course, and every reason to believe that the enslaved house staff at Blue Spring did the majority of the work, while Julia made sure that, quote, everything that was necessary for the occasion was prepared in fine order, given her reputation as, quote, the chief manager of the domestic concerns of the house. We can also assume that Julia and her daughters met both President Monroe and the Marquis de Lafayette during their visits. Contemporaries mention how Richard recognized Julia, quote, as his wife, the mistress of his parlor and the mother of his household, and that he unblushingly treated the girls as his daughters, placing them at the same table with the most honorable of his white guests, end quote. Indeed, Ebenezer Hiram Stedman, who was a townsperson who lived in Georgetown, he went to the Blue Spring that day to see Lafayette, and he confirms that Imogene and Adeline were in attendance at the party for the general, and that they performed for the crowd. Quote, Johnson's two daughters played on the piano fine. They were dressed as fine as money could dress them, and to one that did not know, they were as white as any of the ladies there, and there were a good many, end quote. While none of these occasions speak directly about Julia's presence, we do know that she attended a special electioneering barbecue at Choctaw Academy in 1832. A man with the initials JHS sent a letter to the Lexington Observer on July the 26th of that year about his attendance at a party, which the paper published on August the 2nd. In addition to discussing matters of a political nature, the writer mentioned that there was much good food and wine at the event. There was always wine at Johnson's events. I'm telling you. And that everyone, quote, had much fun and sport. He also said that Julia was there. According to the source, quote, Miss J, and then there was a number of stars, you know who I mean, was dressed in the most brilliant manner and really looked very pretty. The color of her dress was adapted with much taste to her complexion, and she was the greatest belle present. Now, the first name not being given does leave some room for speculation as to which Johnson woman the writer was referring to. It's unlikely that it was Imogene. She was already married by 1832, and she would have been known as Mrs. Pence. Also, since Imogene and her sister were both supposedly light enough to pass for white, the comment about complexion suggests, at least to me, that the writer was referring to Julia and not her other daughter, Adeline. Either way, it's one of the Johnson women. I'm betting money that it's Julia. So, the level of authority that Julia had at Blue Spring, her wide-ranging abilities in terms of household management, and the variety of labor she performed all shed light on how Richard could afford to be away for such long periods of time. He knew that his home and business interests were in good hands. It also explains why Julia Chinn's sudden death left such a void at Blue Spring. While several people on the farm expired in the cholera epidemic of 1833, Julia's death that summer affected every facet of life on the farm. We glimpsed this when Richard wrote in March of 1834 that, quote, there is not a day in the year that coffee is not furnished for every boy in the school, and that of the best quality, except during the cholera when there was some derangement in the cooking, owing to the death of the formidable cook and the sickness of others. 2 days later, in response to concerns raised by the Choctaw chiefs about the students being inadequately clothed, Richard reflected that the students' complaints to the chiefs might have originated in the letters sent, quote, soon after the cholera, when matters were deranged. One suspects from Richard's choice of words that in addition to matters of food preparation and student clothing, it was his emotional and mental state that was deranged. Hardly surprising considering he had just lost his partner of over 2 decades. One can assume that Julia's passing deeply affected her daughters as well. What can the archives tell us about Julia and Richard's children? We know that Imogene was born February 17, 1812. No birth date has been recovered for Adeline, although she appears to have been the younger of the two daughters, having married 2 years after her sister. We do not, unfortunately, have confirmed images of either girl, and only one source mentions what they look like. According to Lula Craig's manuscript on the history of Nicodemus, Kansas, both girls were beautiful. One was a, quote, brunette with wavy black hair flowing below her waist. The other was a decided blonde that did not show signs of a single drop of Negro blood, end quote. Craig's oral history, which was conducted in the 1880s and is based on information from some of Johnson's ex-slaves, also tells us that the girls were, quote, well-trained, having been educated in private schools. Additional sources, however, tell us that both girls, while well-educated, didn't attend school, private or otherwise. They were instead tutored at home by Thomas Henderson, who was headmaster of Choctaw Academy. Indeed, their father mentioned his daughter's education no less than a dozen times in letters to Henderson between December of 1825 and April of 1826. That's like 4 months. Richard was somewhat fanatical about Imogene and Adeline's schooling. One can imagine that Julia was as well. As a most likely enslaved yet literate woman, she knew how critical an education would be to her daughter's ability to rise in standing, both socially and economically. This might be why she kept Richard up to date on Henderson's commitment to their daughter's education. It also explains why Richard asked Thomas to, quote, pay every attention to my family that you can. And he repeatedly reminded the headmaster to continue his work with the girls, and alternated between praising him for his efforts and promising to reward him for it financially, and chastising him for not keeping him up to date on his daughter's academic progress. He went so far as to state that Henderson's attentions to his daughters would continue to influence, quote, my arrangements for you with the government. A not so subtle hint that the man's job as headmaster of Choctaw Academy depended on his success with Imogene and Adeline. Letters also reveal that the girls' training, which focused in large part on grammar and punctuation, which is a lot more than what it sounds like. Basically, he was asking for them to receive a full-on private, like boarding school type education that women would have received, white women would have received back in the day. It was supposed to be a private matter. He didn't want anybody knowing that girls were getting this education. Despite the fact that Kentucky actually had no laws prohibiting the education of even enslaved people, unlike most other states at the time. Expecting Henderson to visit his house every night, even on those Sundays that they didn't go to church, Richard mentioned that Thomas's visits to the house to hear lessons was, quote, a matter personal to me. And he concluded that, quote, it is best to keep our arrangements to ourselves and do our own duty. Although this placed a heavy burden on Henderson, it apparently paid off. In 1835, Henderson wrote a letter that was published in the newspapers and said that if anyone was unaware of Adeline and Imogene's parentage and met them, they, quote, would not suspect them to be what they really are, the children of a colored woman. He then revealed that at Richard's request, he, quote, engaged on evenings after the ordinary duties of the academy was over to give lessons to about 6 or 8 servants and the 2 females spoken of before. I soon discovered such uncommon aptness in those 2 girls to take learning, and so much decent, modest, and unassuming conduct on their part, that my mind became much enlisted in their favor. I continued to give them lessons until their education was equal or superior to most of the females in the country. Henderson's words provide additional clues about Imogene and Adeline. First, they were clearly light-skinned, apparently fair enough to pass for white, given that Thomas said strangers wouldn't have guessed that they were the children of a colored woman. Next, they were intelligent, displaying an uncommon aptness for learning, although one isn't sure if their aptitude was uncommon, in his opinion, because they were female, persons of color, or both. Additionally, they were morally upright, being of decent, modest, and unassuming conduct. So much so that Thomas found himself becoming their advocate, very much in their favor. High praise indeed, given that the man's profession, prior to taking over Choctaw Academy, was that of Baptist minister. It is safe to assume then that Imogene and Adeline were both very respectable in both dress and demeanor. Finally, the girls' schooling went far beyond a basic understanding of the 3 R's. By the time they reached adulthood, both had received an education equal or superior to most of the females in the country. Given the abysmal and often illegal conditions under which antebellum blacks were educated, even those who were free, it is fair to assume that Henderson meant white females, since he would have known that Adeline and Imogene were better educated than the majority of 19th century black women. In addition to being respectable, intelligent, and educated, Imogene and Adeline were also publicly known to be Julia's daughters by Richard Johnson. While their father may have wanted their schooling to be kept a secret, he apparently made no attempt to hide their parentage. He never contradicted widely circulated statements that he was married to Julia, or that her 2 daughters were his own. Indeed, using the influence of his name and wealth, contemporaries claimed that he sought to have the girls, who appear to have used his last name, recognized in society, introducing them into the highest and most fashionable circles of the community and into ballrooms. Both girls eventually grew up and married local white men, who were fully aware of their wives' black ancestry. According to newspaper announcements, the younger daughter, Miss Adeline J. Johnson, a mulatto girl, reputed to be the daughter of the Honorable Richard Mentor Johnson, representative in Congress, married Thomas W. Scott, a white man, on November the 8th, 1832 in Scott County, Kentucky. Now, if Adeline was younger than Imogene, who was born in 1812, Adeline would have been less than 20 years old when she married Thomas. So who was Thomas? Born in Montgomery County, Maryland on December the 2nd of 1808, Thomas West Scott was the son of Amos Scott and Nancy West Scott, both from that same county and state. Trained in the agricultural pursuits, Amos, who was of Scott-Irish ancestry, moved his family to Kentucky in 1814 when Thomas was only 6 years old. The Scotts settled near the town of Georgetown, and Amos engaged in planting until 1832. Now that year, the same year that his son married Adeline Johnson, Amos and Nancy relocated to Buena Vista Township in Schuyler County, Illinois, where they spent the rest of their days. The land they settled on was supposedly purchased for them by their son Thomas, who made the journey to Rushville in 1829. He opened a little store in the village, and he remained in the mercantile business in Illinois until he returned to Kentucky at some point prior to marrying Adeline in 1832. What's unclear is if the senior Scotts left Kentucky because they were dismayed by their son's marriage to a woman of color, or if the move had already been planned. It's unclear. It's even possible that Thomas was able to purchase that land for his parents because he married Adeline. And I say this because Thomas doesn't appear to have ever run a retail business again after his marriage. The day after he married Adeline, the couple was deeded Blue Spring Farm by Richard, right? So Adeline's marriage brings her into possession of her childhood home, right? The couple get the farm jointly as the wedding gift, basically. So we can assume that Julia is quite relieved to see her younger daughter married and settled into an estate of her own. And she had to have played a significant role in arranging the marriage and having Blue Spring transferred to Adeline. It's highly unlikely that she didn't speak to Richard about their daughter's future. Given her own personal history, her business savvy, her literacy, Julia knew how important that this marriage and ownership of real property would be to her daughter's financial stability and to forging a fuller freedom for herself. As for Richard, he's no dummy. He's a lawyer by training, and he's a career politician. He knew that Adeline's color and, under Kentucky law, the illegitimacy, right, of her birth, her potential slave status would have endangered any inheritance he tried to give her directly. He thus waited until after she was married to a white man, and then he deeded the farm to them jointly. And he deeded slaves to them and gave them money and all kinds of other stuff. Now, even before she took ownership of Blue Spring, Adeline had already been performing a range of tasks on the plantation. She had been helping her mom with a lot of the chores that were associated with running Choctaw Academy, including sewing clothes for the students and laundering their uniforms. So it's understandable because it would have been much too much work to oversee the school and the farm for one person. Adeline also started writing letters to her father when she got a little bit older to help keep him informed on what was happening on Blue Spring, just like her mother did. So she was already a great help around Blue Spring in the late 1820s, and she really became her father's right hand after her mother passed away from cholera in 1833. And in fact, in a letter that he wrote to his daughter in December of that year, Richard, after discussing the academy and certain slave laborers and social things in Washington, D.C., he actually mentioned to Adeline like how industrious she was, how pleased he was with all of her hard work, but he cautioned her to take care of herself. He didn't want her overdoing it, make sure that because she was kind of fragile. Her health was a little bit fragile. But in years to come, Adeline would take on a lot of the responsibility of running things at Blue Spring. The problem was that Adeline actually sadly dies pretty young. She doesn't have a whole lot of years left to run things at Blue Spring. We don't know exactly, what causes her death, but we do know that she dies early in 1836. Given her age, she would have been less than 24 years old when she passed away, and she had only been married for just over 3 years. It's very likely, I did the math, she might have died in childbirth, is what I'm assuming. It would have been her second pregnancy because she did have a son in 1834. And his name was Robert Johnson Scott, named for her grandfather, right, Richard's father. And Adeline's death just devastates Richard, right? He's just lost in less than 3 years his wife and his daughter. And it devastates him emotionally and physically because he's really come to depend on her for running things. And he writes this amazing letter, which I'd love to read you actually the quote. It's a fairly long quote, but as to the removal of the store on the property, that I must leave to the wishes and opinions of Mr. Pence, Imogene's husband, and Mr. Scott. And to future events and consequences resulting from the death of Adeline, I thank you and all who administered to that lovely and innocent child in her final and awful hour. She was a source of inexhaustible happiness and comfort to me. She was mild and prudent. She was wise in her counsel beyond her years and obedient to every thought and every advice of mine for her whole life. I do not recollect that she ever done an act that even ruffled my temper. She was a firm and great prop to my happiness here, but she is gone where sorrow and sighing can never disturb her peaceful and quiet bosom. She is happy and has left me unhappy in mourning her loss, which perhaps I ought not to do, knowing what a happy change she has made. Richard's letter reveals several things about Adeline. First, it appears that father and daughter had a loving relationship, given that she was a source of inexhaustible happiness and comfort to Richard, and a firm and great prop to his contentment here on earth. Next, she seems to have had many of the qualities that antebellum Americans respected in the gentler sex. She was mild-mannered, which implies she was peaceful, a woman who wasn't argumentative, but instead kind and calm and serene. She was also prudent, a term used to indicate a person who was careful, sensible, and practical, particularly with regards to their words and their finances. That pairs well with the fact that she was a wise woman, able to give solid counsel to her father. This was high praise indeed, coming from a man who spent 44 years of his life in politics. She was also an obedient daughter who never ruffled her father's temper. Ultimately, she knew her place, and she was obedient to every thought and advice of Richard's for her whole life. While it's possible that Richard was visualizing Adeline through grief-colored glasses that exalted her beyond reality, his letter doesn't differ from what Thomas Henderson wrote about Adeline and her sister in 1835. Losing both Julia and Adeline in less than 3 years had to have affected Richard mightily. One child remained to him, however, and that's Imogene. I'm actually not going to go into much about Imogene, only just for the purposes of time. And we have a little less information, well, actually, no, I have information on her, but time. Time is the thing. But let me just go ahead and sort of go to my conclusion. So, the details of life at Blue Spring Farm suggest that Julia Chinn and her daughters had fairly full lives, and that local whites accepted the Chinn-Johnson relationship to a large extent. Educated, well-dressed, trained to play the piano, and exercising oversight over their enslaved laborers, the Johnson women's daily lives looked in many respects like those of their white neighbors. Some of these folks, like Thomas Henderson, were won over by the positive characteristics of the women in Richard's life and became their advocates. Daniel Pence and Thomas Scott, both local white men, married into the family. Others either ignored the union or accepted it to a point, performing wedding ceremonies for the family, attending parties at Blue Spring that were organized and overseen by Julia, and doing business with her when Richard was away. There were limits to such tolerance, however, as I've discovered, but that shows up in the later chapters, which I didn't cover today. For centuries, whites have claimed that interracial unions did not exist, or that they took place amongst poor whites that lived with their black lovers in secrecy and shame. Such parameters do not reflect the lives of Julia and Richard, or Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. This project thus forces us to acknowledge that such relationships were not anomalies, and that slavery, sex, and race deeply impacted American politics. The work also expands, this work in particular expands on scholars like Joshua Rothman, further illuminating, quote, the gaps that existed between the ideals that antebellum Americans projected about themselves versus the substance of life on the ground in their society. There was all this public rhetoric against interracial sex, but there was a daily toleration and acceptance of it. So there's this space between the two. And that space holds its course, from the eastern seaboard to the new frontier, from rural areas to urban ports, from the deep south to Washington, D.C. No book has been published on the Chin women to date, and studies of interracial relationships in the Old South are still few in number. Remembering Julia thus joins a growing body of scholarship and will hopefully make several contributions to the field, shedding light on antebellum attitudes towards interracial sex nationwide, bringing Black women's lives to the center of Southern history, placing the Upper South at the center of the story of slavery and freedom. It's still a really understudied region, and revealing the impact that race, slavery, and sex had on the national political landscape. If we wish to understand the ways in which sex, gender, race, and power work together in antebellum America, we must analyze the lives of women like Julia and her daughters, interrogate their abilities to make their own choices, and highlight their struggles to acquire rights and privileges. It's critical we do so, even though it means relying in large part on white documents that utilize the male gaze in order to unearth Black women's stories from the archives. It's important that we know who Julia was. We also have to ask how much choice she had in engaging in a relationship with Richard. It's important to interrogate when and how her union with Richard began, what people thought about the union, how they treated Julia and her daughters, and how they reacted to the couple's relationship matters. We have to understand what privileges she and her daughters had and which ones were just out of reach. It's important to investigate how her and her daughters viewed slavery and how they interacted with Richard's white kin. It's only by asking these kinds of questions, employing the lenses of race and gender, and by utilizing a variety of methodologies, including Black studies, women and gender history, material culture, and ethnography, that we will better comprehend the range and complexity of Black female life and behavior in the antebellum era, and be able to draw broader conclusions about the fluidity and limits of American democracy and freedom in the 19th century. The tale of Julia and Richard is, in many ways, that of one interracial Southern family. More broadly, however, it analyzes the multifaceted nature of 19th century attitudes towards interracial sex and brings the lives of Black women to the forefront of Southern history. It also reveals the challenges inherent in doing research on Black women in the antebellum period, the methods scholars must utilize when dealing with such subjects, and the lenses we must employ, the questions we must ask if we wish to expand the story of American freedom and democracy and bring Black women's voices and stories in from the margins to the center of US history. Thank you.